Hey everyone, welcome back to Sleepless Survivors. Tonight we're diving into something cold, something brutal, something that'll make you grateful for your thermostat. We're talking about Viking winters, the kind of cold that doesn't just bite, it devours. Forget the romanticised sagas and Hollywood heroes with their perfectly braided beards. We're going to walk through what life was actually like when the frost came, when the sun barely rose, and when survival wasn't about glory. It was about making it to spring with all your fingers and toes still attached. So before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of content, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what the temperature is right now. I'm curious to see who's bundled up and who's already living in their own personal Viking winter. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, you'll want one for this, and let's step back in time to the frozen shores of Scandinavia, circa 900 CE. Let's ease into this together. Chapter 1. Welcome to the North. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 935, somewhere along the coast of Norway. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? It's November, and winter is coming. Not metaphorically, literally. And it's going to try very hard to kill you. Your bed, if you can call it that, is a wooden platform covered in furs. Not the soft, professionally tanned furs you see at a Renaissance fair. These are rough, half-cured animal skins that smell like wet dog smoke and something that might have died in them last spring. Beneath the furs is straw, which serves as both mattress and home to an entire civilization of fleas, lice, and other tiny creatures you'd rather not think about. There are no alarm clocks here, just the pale grey light seeping through the gaps in the longhouse walls and the sound of wind howling outside like a hungry wolf. It's a sound you'll get very familiar with over the next 4 months. You try to stretch, but your joints protest immediately. The cold has seeped into your bones overnight. The longhouse, while better than sleeping outside, is essentially a wooden tunnel filled with smoke, people and livestock. Yes, livestock. The cows, sheep and goats sleep on one end of the longhouse while you sleep on the other, separated by nothing but a low partition. Their body heat helps warm the space, but it also means you're sharing your air with the fragrant bouquet of manure, wet wool and fermenting hay. The temperature inside is maybe a few degrees warmer than outside, which means it's still cold enough to see your breath, cold enough that the water bucket near the door has a skin of ice on top, and cold enough that getting out from under your pile of furs feels like an act of violence against yourself. But you have to, because in Viking Scandinavia, winter isn't a season you coast through with hot cocoa and Netflix. It's a test, a brutal, months-long examination where the passing grade is survival, and failure means freezing, starving, or going mad in the darkness. Your home is what's called a longhouse, a rectangular structure made of wood, turf and stone, with a thatched roof that leaks when it rains and sags under the weight of snow. It's dark inside. There are no windows, just a few small openings near the roof to let out smoke from the central hearth. Most of the time, those openings are covered to keep the warmth in, which means the interior is perpetually dim and hazy. The walls are lined with benches that double as beds. Everyone sleeps in the main hall, your spouse, your children, your parents if they're still alive, maybe a thrall or two if you're wealthy enough to own slaves. Privacy? That's a concept that won't be invented for another several centuries. You sit up wincing as your feet touch the cold dirt floor. Yes, dirt. The floor of your longhouse is packed earth, covered in rushes and straw that haven't been changed since autumn. It's damp, it's cold, and if you're unlucky, it's also home to a few puddles of something you'd rather not identify. Around you, the rest of the household is beginning to stir. Your wife is already up, rekindling the fire in the central hearth. Your children are huddled together under furs, reluctant to face the cold. The livestock at the far end of the longhouse are making their presence known with grunts, bleats, and the occasional thud against the partition. This is your reality. This is your home. And this is just the beginning of a day that will test every ounce of resilience you have. Welcome to winter in Viking Scandinavia, where the sun barely rises, the cold never stops, and survival is a daily negotiation with nature. Let's see if you have what it takes. Chapter 2. The morning routine. So you've managed to drag yourself out of bed. Congratulations. Now comes the part where you realise that every single thing you need to do today, every basic human function, is going to be cold, difficult, and possibly dangerous. Let's start with the bathroom situation. Spoiler alert, there is no bathroom. If you need to relieve yourself in the middle of the night, you have a few options, none of them pleasant. Option 1 is a wooden bucket kept near your sleeping area. It's communal, it's rarely emptied as often as it should be, and by midwinter it's developing its own ecosystem. The smell is something you've learned to ignore, mostly because you have no choice. Option 2 is venturing outside to the designated spot behind the longhouse. This means putting on whatever clothes you can find, probably still damp from yesterday, wrapping yourself in a cloak and stepping out into the howling darkness. The wind hit you like a physical blow. The temperature is well below freezing, and if there's fresh snow it's knee-deep. You trudge through the snow, trying not to think about the fact that wolves have been spotted near the village, that the snow is so deep you could easily lose your footing and tumble down the hillside, or that frostbite can set in within minutes on exposed skin. You do your business as quickly as humanly possible, surrounded by the dark shapes of trees and the endless sound of the wind. There's no toilet paper, obviously. You use what's available: snow, moss, or a handful of straw you brought with you if you were smart. Then you stumble back to the longhouse, already shivering so hard your teeth are chattering. Inside, the fire is finally starting to catch. Your wife has been nursing it carefully, adding small pieces of kindling and blowing on the embers until flames begin to lick upward. Fire is life in the Viking winter. It's the difference between surviving and freezing to death in your sleep. But fire is also demanding. You don't have matches, you don't have lighters, you have a fire steel, a piece of iron that you strike against flint to create sparks. If the fire goes out completely, getting it started again is a process that can take half an hour or more, assuming your hands aren't too frozen to work the steel properly. Keeping the fire going all winter requires a massive amount of fuel. We're talking cords upon cords of wood, peat, and dried animal dung. Wood has to be gathered during the summer and autumn, cut, split, and stored somewhere dry. If you didn't gather enough, if you miscalculated, if there was an early frost, if your storage shed collapsed under snow, you're in trouble. Running out of firewood in January isn't an inconvenience, it's a death sentence. So every day begins the same way. Check the fire, add fuel, make sure it doesn't go out. This is your life support system. This is your heating, your cooking, your light source, and your only defence against the cold that wants to seep through every crack in the walls and wrap itself around your heart. Once the fire is stable, it's time to think about washing. And by washing I mean, well, not much. Bathing in the winter is rare. The Norse actually had a reputation for being relatively clean by medieval standards. They bathed more often than many of their European neighbours, but winter changes the equation. Water has to be carried from a well or a nearby stream, assuming it hasn't frozen solid. If it has, you need to break through the ice first, which means swinging an axe in sub-zero temperatures until your hands are numb and your breath comes in ragged gasps. Then you haul the water back to the longhouse in wooden buckets, trying not to slip on the ice. Once you have water, you have to heat it. This takes time and fuel, both of which are precious. So most days, washing means splashing a little cold water on your face and hands, if that. Full baths are reserved for special occasions or Saturday nights, which is how Saturday got its name in Old Norse, Logadag, or washing day. Your hair gets grimy. Your skin develops a layer of oil and smoke residue. You smell like wood smoke, sweat, and animals. So does everyone else. After a while, you stop noticing. Dental hygiene is similarly minimal. There are no toothbrushes. Some people chew on twigs to clean their teeth, usually hazel or willow, which have natural antibacterial properties. Others rinse their mouths with water or weak ale. But tooth decay is common, and by your 30s, you're likely missing a few teeth. Toothaches are a constant companion, and there's no dentist to visit. You either tough it out, or have someone pull the tooth with a pair of iron tongs. Now that you've managed to answer nature's call, tend the fire, and splash some frigid water on your face, it's time to get dressed. This is where things get interesting, and by interesting, I mean uncomfortable. Your clothing is made entirely of wool, linen and animal skins. There's no cotton, no synthetic fabrics, no moisture-wicking technology. Just layers upon layers of scratchy, heavy, often damp material. You start with an undershirt made of linen or wool, then a wool tunic that falls to your knees. Over that, wool trousers or leg wrappings, long strips of cloth that you wind around your legs and secure with leather straps. Then a wool cloak, fastened at the shoulder with a bronze or iron brooch. On your feet you have leather shoes or boots. If you're lucky, they're lined with fur. If you're not, they're just leather, and they will get wet. Wet leather doesn't dry quickly in the winter, which means your feet are going to be cold and damp most of the time. Frostbite is a real concern. You'll lose toes if you're not careful. Your hands are protected by mittens made of wool or fur. Gloves with individual fingers are rare and expensive. Mittens keep your hands warmer, but they also make fine motor tasks nearly impossible. Good luck trying to fix a fishing net or carve an axe handle while wearing mittens that feel like oven mitts made of sheep. On your head, you wear a wool or fur hat. Most people also wrap a scarf around their face to protect against the wind. You learn quickly that exposed skin is the enemy. Even with all these layers, you're not truly warm. The wind finds its way through every gap. The cold seeps in at your wrists, your ankles, the back of your neck. You're perpetually chilly, and you've learned to accept that as the baseline for existence. And here's the worst part. You're going to wear these clothes every single day for the next 4 months. There is no outfit change. You don't have a closet full of options. You have what you're wearing, and maybe one spare set if you're wealthy. Laundry in winter is almost impossible, so your clothes get progressively filthier as the season wears on. By February you'll smell like a bog, but so will everyone else, so at least you're in good company. Now you're dressed, the fire is burning and the day is beginning. You might think the hard part is over. It's not. It's just started. Chapter 3. Breakfast, or the lack thereof. You're cold, you're tired, your joints ache, and your stomach is growling. Time for breakfast. Except breakfast in a Viking winter isn't exactly a feast. Let's be clear. Food in the winter is survival rations, not cuisine. Everything you eat has been preserved, salted, smoked, pickled, dried, or fermented, because fresh food doesn't exist. The growing season ended months ago. The animals have been slaughtered. The fish have stopped biting. What you have now is what you put away in the autumn, and it has to last until spring. If you miscalculated, if the harvest was bad, if your storage was raided by rats, you're in serious trouble. Starvation is a real possibility. People die in the winter, often. Breakfast typically consists of porridge, not the creamy, cinnamon-spiced oatmeal you get at a cafe. This is a thick, gluey mixture of barley or oats boiled in water or milk, with maybe a pinch of salt if you're lucky. It's bland, it's filling, and it's the same thing you'll eat for dinner. The porridge is served in a wooden bowl, eaten with a wooden spoon, and washed down with ale. Yes, ale. Even for breakfast, even for children. Why ale? Because water, even boiled water, can be risky. Springs and wells can become contaminated. Ale, because it's been boiled and fermented, is safer. It's also weak, usually around 2-3% alcohol, so you're not getting drunk at dawn. You're just staying hydrated in the only way that won't give you dysentery. If your household is prosperous, you might have some dried fish to go with your porridge. This isn't fresh, flaky salmon. This is fish that's been dried until it's hard as wood, then soaked in water to soften it up just enough to chew. It's salty, it's fishy, and it's been hanging in your storage shed for 3 months, absorbing the smell of everything around it. You eat it anyway because protein is precious. Bread is another staple, but winter bread is a far cry from a fresh loaf. It's made from barley or rye flour, often mixed with ground peas or even bark to stretch the grain supply. It's dense, dark, and hard enough to break a tooth on. You dip it in your porridge or ale to soften it before attempting to eat it. Butter and cheese, if you have them, are also preserved. Butter is salted heavily to keep it from going rancid. Cheese is aged, hard, and strong-flavoured. If you're truly fortunate, you might have a little honey to drizzle on your porridge, but honey is expensive and usually saved for special occasions or for making mead. Vegetables, only if they're stored properly. Root vegetables like turnips, onions, carrots and beets can last through the winter if kept in a cool, dark storage pit. But by midwinter, they're starting to soften, sprout and rot. You cut away the bad parts and eat what's left. Fresh greens? Forget it. Scurvy is a real danger. By late winter, your gums might be bleeding, your teeth might be loose, and your skin might be covered in bruises. Vitamin C deficiency is common, and there's no orange juice to fix it. You survive on sheer stubbornness and the hope that spring will come before your body gives out entirely. Meat is rare in the winter, unless you're wealthy or recently slaughtered an animal. Most livestock are kept alive through the winter, because they're more valuable living than dead. They provide milk, wool and labour. Only the animals that can't be sustained through the winter are slaughtered in the autumn, and their meat is salted, smoked, or hung in the cold to preserve it. If you do have meat, it's tough, salty, and often half-spoiled. You boil it into a stew with whatever vegetables you have left, and you try not to think too hard about the chunks that don't look quite right. Hunting is an option, but it's dangerous and often unsuccessful. The animals are scarce in winter, hidden away or migrated south. Venturing into the forest means risking exposure, injury, or getting lost. You might come back with a hare or a bird if you're lucky. You might also come back with frostbite and nothing to show for it. Fishing can be done through the ice, but it requires cutting a hole through several feet of frozen lake or river, then sitting in the freezing wind for hours waiting for a bite. Most days you catch nothing. Some days you catch enough to make it worthwhile, but it's a gamble every time. So you sit by the fire, eating your bland porridge, chewing your rock-hard bread, and trying to make peace with the fact that this is what food is now. There's no variety, no flavour, no excitement, just fuel, just survival. And as you scrape the last of the porridge from your bowl, you realise that lunch will be the same thing, and dinner, and tomorrow's breakfast. For the next 4 months, this is your menu. Welcome to Viking meal planning. Chapter 4. The work begins. You've eaten your joyless breakfast. Now it's time to work. Because in the Viking winter, work isn't something you do to pass the time. It's something you do to stay alive. If you're a man, your tasks are mostly outdoors, which means bundling up in every layer you own and venturing out into the frozen hellscape. If you're a woman, your tasks are mostly indoors, which sounds better until you realise that indoors still means dark, smoky, and barely warmer than outside. Let's start with the men. The first task of the day is taking care of the livestock. Remember, your survival depends on these animals. They provide milk, wool, leather, labour, and, if things get desperate, meat. Keeping them alive through the winter is a full-time job. You trudge out to the barn, which is really just an extension of the longhouse or a separate building made of the same wood, turf, and hope. Inside, the cows, sheep, goats, and maybe a pig or two are huddled together, their breath creating clouds of mist in the cold air. They need to be fed. Hay was gathered during the summer and stored in lofts or pits, and now you're rationing it carefully. If you run out of hay before spring, your animals starve. If your animals starve, you starve. It's a simple equation with very high stakes. You pitch hay into the feeding troughs, trying not to think about how the pile is shrinking faster than you'd like. The animals eat hungrily, oblivious to the mathematics of survival. They also need water. This means breaking the ice in the water trough, which has frozen solid overnight, then hauling more water from the well. Your hands are numb within minutes. Your face burns from the wind. But you keep going because stopping isn't an option. If you're fortunate enough to own a horse, it gets special treatment. Horses are incredibly valuable. They're used for transportation, ploughing, and warfare. A good horse can mean the difference between prosperity and poverty. So your horse gets the best hay, regular grooming, and careful attention to its hooves and health. Once the animals are fed and watered, you move on to maintenance tasks. The longhouse needs constant repair. The wind tears at the thatch on the roof. Snow weighs it down until it sags. You have to climb up there, in the freezing cold, and patch the holes before the next storm hits. The door needs fixing. It's been sticking because the wood has swollen with moisture. The fence around the livestock pen has a broken post that needs replacing. The storage shed has a leak that's threatening your precious grain supply. Every day brings a new crisis, a new thing that's broken or breaking, and you have to fix it with numb fingers, limited tools, and the constant nagging awareness that if you don't, things will get worse. Firewood is another endless task. You go through wood at an astonishing rate, several armloads a day just to keep the central hearth burning. You venture into the forest with an axe, trudging through deep snow, searching for dead trees or fallen branches. Chopping wood in the winter is brutal work. The cold makes the wood harder, more brittle. Your axe glances off knots and frozen bark. Your hands blister even through your mittens. Your breath comes in ragged gasps and sweat soaks through your underlayers, which then freezes against your skin. You drag the wood back to the longhouse on a sledge, stack it under cover to keep it dry, and split it into manageable pieces. By the time you're done, your back is screaming. Your shoulders are on fire and your fingers are so cold you can barely grip the axe handle. But you'll do it again tomorrow, and the day after that, because the fire cannot go out. If you live near the coast, you might also check your fishing nets or go ice fishing. This means walking out onto the frozen fjord, which is both beautiful and terrifying. The ice groans and cracks beneath your feet. You drill a hole through the ice using an iron auger, then lower your line and wait. Sometimes you catch fish, sometimes you catch nothing. Sometimes the ice cracks beneath you and you plunge into the frigid water, which means you have approximately 2 minutes to get out before hypothermia kills you. For the women, winter work is equally relentless, just in a different way. Your day begins with rekindling the fire, cooking breakfast, and managing the household. This means grinding grain on a stone quern, which is back-breaking work. You kneel on the floor, pushing a heavy stone in circles to crush barley or rye into flour. Your wrists ache, your knees ache. You do it anyway because bread doesn't make itself. Then there's spinning. Wool doesn't magically turn into clothing. It has to be carded, combed to align the fibres, then spun into thread using a drop spindle. This is a task that never ends. You spin thread while you're sitting by the fire, while you're watching the children, while you're waiting for the stew to boil. Your fingers are always moving, always twisting, always pulling the fibre into thread. Once you have thread, it needs to be woven into fabric. This requires a loom, which is a large, heavy piece of equipment that takes up a significant amount of space in the longhouse. You stand at the loom for hours, passing the shuttle back and forth, building the fabric row by row. It's tedious, repetitive work, but it's also necessary. Your family needs clothing. Clothing wears out, therefore you weave. Then there's sewing. Every piece of clothing, tunics, trousers, cloaks, mittens, hats, has to be sewn by hand. You use bone needles and thread made from linen or sinew. Your stitches have to be tight and strong because a torn seam in the middle of winter can be the difference between warmth and frostbite. You also make shoes. This involves cutting leather, stitching it together, and sometimes reinforcing it with extra layers or fur lining. Shoes wear out quickly, especially in winter, so you're always making new ones. And then there are the children. If you have young children, they require constant supervision. They can't go outside unsupervised, the cold is too dangerous, the snowdrift's too deep, the risk of getting lost too high. So they stay inside, cooped up in the smoky darkness, bored and restless. You try to keep them entertained. You tell them stories, sagas of heroes and gods, tales of giants and elves, warnings about what happens to children who don't listen to their parents. You teach them simple tasks, carding wool, stirring the porridge, feeding the chickens, but mostly they're just underfoot, bickering with each other, crying, demanding attention you don't have time to give. There are no toys, no books, no screens to distract them, just each other and their imaginations. If you have older children, they're expected to work. Boys help with the animals and firewood. Girls help with spinning, weaving and cooking. Everyone contributes because everyone has to. By the time evening falls, you're exhausted. Your hands are raw, your back hurts, your eyes burn from the smoke. But the work isn't done. It's never done. Because in the Viking winter, survival isn't a goal, it's a process, a daily grind of tasks that have to be completed, day after day, week after week, month after month, until the ice finally begins to thaw and the first brave shoots of green push through the frozen earth. Until then, you work, because if you stop, you die. Chapter 5. The Cold That Never Ends. Let's talk about the cold, not in an abstract, poetic way. Let's talk about what cold actually does to your body when you live in it for months on end without central heating, insulation, or any real escape. The cold in Viking Scandinavia during winter isn't just uncomfortable, it's relentless. It's the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and sets up camp there. The kind of cold that makes your joints ache, your muscles cramp, and your skin crack and bleed. Inside the longhouse, even with the fire burning, the temperature hovers just above freezing. The fire provides a small bubble of warmth. If you're sitting close enough, you might feel almost comfortable, but move 6 feet away and you're back in the cold. The walls offer some protection from the wind, but they're not insulated. They're made of wood, turf, and stone, with gaps and cracks everywhere. Cold air leaks in constantly. You stuff the gaps with moss, cloth, and dried grass, but it's never enough. At night, when the fire dies down to embers, the temperature drops even further. You sleep under piles of furs and wool blankets, huddled together with your family for warmth. Even so, you wake up shivering. Your nose is cold, your feet are cold. The tip of your ear pressed against the pillow feels like ice. In the morning there's frost on the inside of the walls, your breath is visible in the air, the water bucket has frozen solid. Outside, it's worse. Much worse. Temperatures in medieval Scandinavia during winter could drop well below zero, especially at night. Add in the wind chill and you're looking at conditions that can cause frostbite in minutes. Frostbite is one of the most common winter injuries. It starts as a tingling sensation in your fingers, toes, nose or ears. Then numbness, then a waxy pale appearance to the skin. If you catch it early and warm the area gradually, you might be fine. If you don't, the tissue dies. Fingers and toes turn black and eventually fall off. You've probably seen at least one person in your village who's missing fingers, or part of an ear. Winter did that. Hypothermia is another constant threat. If your core body temperature drops too low, your body starts shutting down. You feel confused, sluggish, uncoordinated. Your speech slurs. Eventually you stop shivering, which sounds like a relief, but it's actually a bad sign. It means your body has given up trying to warm itself. If you're caught in a blizzard, if you fall through the ice, if you get lost in the forest and can't find your way back before nightfall, hypothermia will kill you. The Norse had strategies for dealing with the cold. They knew how to layer clothing, how to keep moving to generate body heat, how to recognize the signs of frostbite and hypothermia, but knowledge only goes so far. Sometimes the cold wins anyway. Children and the elderly are especially vulnerable. Their bodies don't regulate temperature as effectively. Every winter, some of them don't make it to spring. The psychological impact of the cold is just as brutal as the physical. When you're cold all the time, when you can never fully warm up, when every task requires you to endure discomfort, it wears you down. You become irritable, depressed, exhausted. The long dark nights don't help. In the far north, the sun barely rises in the middle of winter. You might get a few hours of dim grey twilight before darkness falls again. The rest of the time, you're living by firelight, which is dim and flickering and casts strange shadows on the walls. The darkness messes with your mind. You lose track of time. Days blur together. You feel isolated, trapped, cut off from the world. The Norse had a word for this kind of winter depression. Uti. It describes the feeling of being worn down by the cold and dark, of losing hope, of wondering if spring will ever come. To combat this, communities relied heavily on social bonds. People gathered in the longhouse in the evenings to tell stories, sing songs, play games, and drink ale. These gatherings weren't just entertainment, they were psychological survival. They reminded you that you weren't alone, that others were enduring the same hardships, that there was still joy to be found even in the darkest months. But even with community support, the winter could break people. Some became withdrawn, staring into the fire for hours without speaking. Others became violent, lashing out at family members over minor grievances. Cabin fever wasn't just a modern phenomenon, it was a very real problem in the Viking Age. And then there was the wind. The wind in a Viking winter isn't just a breeze, it's a living force, a howling, screaming thing that batters the longhouse, tears at the thatch, and finds every tiny gap in your clothing. It steals your breath, stings your face, and makes it almost impossible to hear anything else. When the wind is blowing, you stay inside if you can. Venturing out is dangerous. You can get disoriented, lose your way, and end up freezing to death within sight of your own home. The Norse believed the wind carried spirits, Draugr, the undead, and other supernatural beings. On the wildest nights, when the wind shrieked around the longhouse, it was easy to believe those stories. So you huddled by the fire, wrapped in your furs, and tried not to think about how many more weeks of this you had to endure. Because the truth is, you didn't know. You didn't have calendars marking off the days. You didn't have weather forecasts telling you when the thaw would come. You just had to trust that it would, eventually, and that you'd still be alive when it did. The cold was your constant companion, your enemy, the thing you fought against every single day, knowing you could never truly win, only survive long enough to see another season. And that, more than anything, is what defined a Viking winter. Not glory, not adventure, just cold, endless, grinding, soul-crushing cold. Chapter 6. Water, the frozen enemy. In the modern world, water is easy. You turn a tap, and it flows. Clean, safe, drinkable water whenever you want it. In a Viking winter, water is a daily battle. Let's start with the most basic problem. Everything is frozen. The streams are frozen. The wells are frozen. The water troughs are frozen. Even the small barrel you keep inside the longhouse for emergencies has a layer of ice on top by morning. Getting water means breaking ice. This isn't a quick job. Depending on how cold it's been, the ice on a well can be several inches thick. You need an iron bar or a heavy axe to crack through it. You swing, and the ice splinters. You swing again, and chunks break free. Your hands are numb, your face is numb, but you keep swinging because you need water. Once you've broken through, you lower a bucket on a rope into the well. In the summer, this is simple. In the winter, the rope is stiff with ice, the bucket is frozen, and your fingers don't want to grip properly. You haul the bucket back up, sloshing freezing water over your hands, and carry it back to the longhouse before it freezes solid. If you live near a river or stream, the process is similar. You find a spot where the current keeps the ice thinner, chop through it, and fill your bucket. But rivers are dangerous in winter. The ice near the banks can be deceptively thin. Step in the wrong place, and you go through. If you fall into a frozen river, your chances of survival are slim. Once you have water, you need to do something with it quickly because it will freeze. If you're drinking it, you drink it cold. If you're cooking with it, you heat it over the fire, which takes time and firewood. Bathing, as I mentioned earlier, is rare, but even basic washing requires heated water. You fill a pot, hang it over the fire, and wait for it to warm. This can take an hour or more. By the time it's ready, you've used up a significant amount of firewood for the privilege of washing your face and hands. Laundry is even more of a production. You need a lot of water, enough to soak and scrub your clothes. You heat it in large pots, pour it into wooden tubs, and then scrub the fabric with your hands or a wooden paddle. In the winter, this means your hands are plunged into cold, soapy water, soap made from animal fat and ash, which is harsh and drying. By the time you're done, your hands are red, raw, and cracked. Then you have to dry the clothes. In the summer, you hang them outside in the sun. In the winter, you hang them inside near the fire where they steam and fill the longhouse with even more moisture and smoke. They take forever to dry, and they never quite lose the smell of smoke and damp. Drinking water is another concern. Even though you're drawing water from a well or a stream, there's no guarantee it's safe. Medieval people didn't understand germ theory, but they knew that water could make you sick. That's why ale and mead were preferred. They'd been boiled during the brewing process, which killed bacteria, but you can't always drink ale. Sometimes you need water. You boil it if you can, but that requires time and fuel. Often, you just drink it and hope for the best. Waterborne illnesses, dysentery, cholera, various parasites, are common. If you get sick in the winter, your chances of recovery are lower. You're already weakened by the cold and limited diet. Your body doesn't have the resources to fight off infection effectively. People die from diarrhea. It's not dramatic, but it's deadly. And then there's the issue of sanitation. You're using water for drinking, cooking and washing, but you're also dealing with human and animal waste. Ideally, these are kept separate. In practice, especially in a cramped longhouse, contamination is a constant risk. The animals produce a lot of waste. You muck out the barn or the animal section of the longhouse periodically, shoveling manure into piles outside. But in deep winter, when the snow is too deep or the cold too brutal, you might let it accumulate longer than you should. The smell becomes overwhelming. The risk of disease increases. Human waste is disposed of in pits, or thrown into designated areas away from the living quarters. But in a small village, with everyone dumping waste in roughly the same places, and with everything frozen solid, you're essentially creating a toxic time bomb that will thaw in the spring and contaminate everything. The Norse were actually quite fastidious by medieval standards. They bathed more regularly than many other European cultures, valued cleanliness, and had communal bathhouses in some larger settlements. But winter made all of that nearly impossible. So you make do. You use as little water as possible. You drink ale. You wash your face when you can. You try not to think about the fact that everything, your clothes, your body, your home, is accumulating layers of grime that won't be properly cleaned until the spring thaw. Water, the very essence of life, becomes one of your greatest challenges. Every drop requires effort. Every use requires planning. And every day you're acutely aware that you're one contaminated drink away from a sickness that could kill you. This is survival without plumbing, without filtration, without the infrastructure that makes water safe and accessible. This is life when water itself is an enemy that has to be fought, broken, heated and rationed. And you do it all while your hands are frozen and your back is aching and the wind is howling outside like it wants to swallow the world. Chapter 7. Medicine in the frozen dark. Let's say something goes wrong. And in a Viking winter, something always goes wrong. You cut your hand while chopping wood. Your child develops a fever. Your grandmother's cough gets worse. Your husband slips on the ice and breaks his arm. Now what? Welcome to Viking medicine, where the treatments range from surprisingly effective to absolutely terrifying, with very little in between. The Norse had a sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine. They knew which plants could reduce fever, which could stop bleeding, which could ease pain. Women especially were knowledgeable about healing herbs, and this knowledge was passed down through generations. But here's the problem. It's winter. The plants are dead or buried under 3 feet of snow. Any medicine you're going to use has to have been gathered during the summer and autumn, dried and stored properly. If you were diligent, you have a collection of dried herbs hanging in bundles from the rafters of the longhouse. If you weren't, or if your stores got damp and mouldy, you're in trouble. Common remedies included yarrow for stopping bleeding, willow bark for pain and fever. It contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Honey for wound treatment. It's naturally antibacterial. Garlic for infections. Chamomile for digestive issues. Mugwort for women's health issues. These remedies actually worked to varying degrees. The Norse weren't just making things up. They had centuries of empirical knowledge about what helped and what didn't. But there were limits to what herbs could do. Let's say you cut your hand badly. The wound is deep, bleeding heavily. You press yarrow into it to stop the bleeding, then wrap it with clean linen. If you're lucky, it heals. If you're not, it gets infected. Infection in the medieval world is a death sentence waiting to happen. There are no antibiotics. Once bacteria gets into a wound, it's a race between your immune system and the infection. Often, the infection wins. You'll know it's infected because the wound will become red, hot, swollen. Pus will form. Red streaks might appear on your skin radiating from the wound. That's blood poisoning, and it means the infection is spreading through your body. At this point, your options are limited. You can try poultices made from honey, garlic, and various herbs. You can try draining the pus. You can pray to the gods. But mostly you wait and see if your body can fight it off. If the infection is in a limb and it's clear you're going to die without intervention, there's one last option: amputation. This is done without anaesthesia. Maybe you're given strong ale to drink or a leather strap to bite down on, but that's it. Someone, probably not a trained surgeon because those don't really exist in rural Scandinavia, will heat an axe or a large knife in the fire, then hack through your arm or leg as quickly as possible. The goal is to get through the bone before you pass out from pain or blood loss. Once the limb is off, they cauterise the wound with a hot iron to stop the bleeding. The smell of burning flesh fills the longhouse. If you survive the procedure, and that's a big if, you still have to survive the recovery. Infection, blood loss and shock all want to kill you. But some people do survive. You see them in the village. One-armed fishermen, men limping on crude wooden crutches, women with missing fingers. Broken bones are another common winter injury. Ice is slippery. People fall, a lot. If you break an arm or a leg, the treatment is fairly straightforward. The bone needs to be set. Someone who has done this before will pull the limb straight, align the bone as best they can by feel, then splint it with wooden boards and strips of cloth. You'll be given willow bark to chew for the pain, but it doesn't do much. Mostly, you just endure. The bone will heal over the course of weeks or months, but it might not heal straight. Many people walk with limps or have arms that don't quite bend right after a break. If the break is compound, meaning the bone has pierced through the skin, your chances of survival drop dramatically. The wound will almost certainly become infected. An infection of the bone is particularly deadly. Childbirth deserves its own discussion, because it's one of the most dangerous things a woman can go through in the Viking Age. There are no hospitals, no doctors, no surgical interventions. When a woman goes into labour, she's attended by other women, her mother, sisters, neighbours, maybe a midwife if the community has one. Labour happens in the longhouse, usually near the fire for warmth. The woman might squat, kneel, or use a birthing chair. The other women offer support, encouragement, and whatever practical help they can. Most births go fine. Women have been giving birth for millennia, and bodies generally know what to do. But when something goes wrong, it goes very wrong. If the baby is positioned incorrectly, if the labour goes on too long, if there's excessive bleeding, there's very little that can be done. The midwife might try to turn the baby manually, reaching inside to adjust its position. This is agonising and dangerous, but sometimes it works. If it doesn't work, both mother and baby might die. Maternal mortality rates were high. Many women died in childbirth or from complications shortly after. This was so common that it was simply accepted as one of the risks of being female. For other illnesses, fevers, coughs, stomach ailments, the treatments were hit or miss. You might be given herbal teas, steam inhalation, or warm compresses. You might be bled, because the Norse, like many cultures, believed that removing bad blood could cure illness. Sometimes these treatments helped, sometimes they did nothing, sometimes they made things worse, and through it all you were dealing with the cold. Healing requires rest and warmth, but warmth is a limited resource. You lie under your furs, shivering, hoping your body can fight off whatever is attacking it, while the wind howls outside and the fire crackles low. Mental illness was understood differently in the Viking Age. Depression, what we might call PTSD, seasonal affective disorder, these weren't diagnosed as medical conditions. They were seen as spiritual problems or as weakness, or as being touched by the gods. If someone became deeply depressed or violent or catatonic, there wasn't much that could be done. They might be cared for by their family. They might be feared and isolated. In extreme cases, they might be killed or abandoned. The Norse believed in fate, word, the idea that your destiny was already woven by the Norns. If you got sick, if you died, it was because that was your fate. This belief could be comforting in some ways. It meant suffering had a purpose, a place in the grand design. But it also meant there was limited motivation to fight against disease or injury. What would happen would happen. Still, people tried. They used the knowledge they had. They fought for survival. And sometimes, against all odds, they won. But many didn't. Winter was when the weak, the old, the very young, and the unlucky died. Every spring, when the ice finally melted, there were burials to perform. Bodies that had been kept frozen through the winter were finally laid to rest. This was the reality of Viking medicine, a mixture of practical knowledge, desperate hope, and acceptance of death as a constant companion. Chapter 8. The Darkness and the Mind. We need to talk about the darkness, not as a metaphor, but as a physical oppressive reality that dominates life in the Viking winter. If you're living in southern Scandinavia, modern-day Denmark or southern Sweden, you'll have relatively normal winter days. Short, yes, but you'll still get several hours of daylight. But if you're farther north, in Norway or northern Sweden, the situation is much more extreme. In the far north, above the Arctic Circle, the sun doesn't rise at all for weeks or even months. This is the polar night, and it's exactly as grim as it sounds. Even below the Arctic Circle, winter days are brutally short. You might get 4 or 5 hours of weak grey daylight at most. The sun crawls along the southern horizon, barely clearing the mountains, then sinks back into darkness. The rest of the time, 18 to 20 hours a day, it's dark. This isn't the soft darkness of a summer evening, where the sky glows with twilight. This is deep, cold, absolute darkness. The kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face without a light source. Your only light comes from fire. The central hearth provides flickering illumination, casting dancing shadows on the walls. If you need to move around, you carry a torch or an oil lamp, a small clay or soapstone dish filled with fish oil or animal fat, with a wick made of twisted fibre. These lamps don't provide much light. They're dim, smoky, and they smell like burning fat. But they're all you have. The longhouse at night is a world of shadows. Faces flicker in and out of view. Corners disappear into blackness. The smoke from the fire and lamps makes everything hazy, dreamlike, unreal. This constant darkness does something to the human mind. Humans need light. Our circadian rhythms depend on it. When we're deprived of natural light for extended periods, our brains start to malfunction. We become depressed, lethargic, irritable. Our sleep patterns get disrupted. We lose track of time. This is seasonal affective disorder, and it affects people living in northern latitudes to this day, even with electric lights and modern medicine. Imagine experiencing it without any of those tools. The Norse felt it keenly. They had terms for the deep winter sadness, the sense that the darkness would never end, They told stories to keep their spirits up, stories of the sun's return, of spring's triumph over winter, of light conquering dark. But stories can only do so much. In the darkness, fear grows. The Norse believed the winter was when the supernatural was strongest. The boundaries between the world of the living and the world of spirits grew thin. Draugr, the undead, walked. Trolls came down from the mountains. Elves played tricks on the unwary. These weren't just superstitions. In the long dark nights, when the wind screamed and the longhouse creaked, it was easy to believe something was out there. Something was watching, waiting. Children were terrified of the dark. They huddled close to their parents, refused to go anywhere alone, woke screaming from nightmares. Adults tried to be brave, but they felt it too, that primal fear of the unknown that darkness brings. The isolation made it worse. In the summer you could visit neighbours, travel to nearby villages, see new faces and hear new stories. In the winter you were trapped. Deep snow made travel difficult and dangerous. You might go weeks without seeing anyone outside your immediate household. This isolation bred tension. Families that got along fine in the summer started to grate on each other in the winter. Old arguments resurfaced. New ones erupted over trivial things. There was no escape, no way to get space from people who were driving you mad. Domestic violence increased in the winter. So did feuds between families. The sagas are full of stories of men who nursed grudges through the long winter, then sought revenge when spring came. Suicide, though rarely discussed, was not unknown. People who felt trapped, hopeless, overwhelmed by the darkness and cold sometimes chose to end their suffering. The Norse were pragmatic about death. They didn't have the same religious prohibitions against suicide that Christianity would later impose. If someone chose to die with dignity rather than waste away, that was respected, even if it was sad. To combat the psychological toll of winter, communities developed strategies. Storytelling was crucial. The long winter nights were when the sagas were told, epic tales of heroes, gods and ancestors. These stories served multiple purposes: entertainment, education, cultural preservation, and psychological survival. They reminded people that others had endured hardships before them. They provided models of courage and resilience. They gave people something to think about besides the cold and the dark. Music helped too. The Norse had lyres, flutes and drums. They sang songs, some sad, some bawdy, some celebrating the gods or great deeds. Music brought people together, lifted spirits, made the darkness feel less oppressive. Games were popular. Nefertafel, a strategic board game similar to chess, was played for hours. Dice games, gambling with small stakes, anything to pass the time and keep the mind engaged. Drinking, of course, was common. Ale and mead helped numb the psychological pain, helped people relax and laugh. But excessive drinking brought its own problems: arguments, violence, poor decisions. Feasts, when resources allowed, were major events. A feast wasn't just about food, it was about community, about reaffirming bonds, about celebrating that you'd all made it this far. People dressed in their best clothes, told their best stories, shared what little they had. These gatherings were lifelines. Religious observance also intensified in the winter. The midwinter festival, Yule, was the most important celebration of the year. It marked the turning point, the shortest day, when the sun would finally begin its slow return. Yule involved feasting, sacrifices to the gods, and rituals designed to ensure the sun's return and the community's survival through the rest of the winter. Livestock was slaughtered, providing fresh meat for the feast. Ale flowed freely. People exchanged gifts, usually small handmade items, a carved spoon, a woven band, a polished stone. The Yule log, a massive piece of wood, was ceremonially burned in the hearth, and it was kept burning for the entire festival, sometimes 12 days. The fire represented the sun, warmth, life itself. These rituals weren't empty superstition. They were psychologically crucial. They gave people hope. They marked time. They reminded everyone that winter, no matter how brutal, would eventually end. But between the festivals, between the gatherings, there were long stretches of darkness and isolation. And in those stretches, you had to find your own reasons to keep going. Some people turned inward, developing rich inner lives. They contemplated the gods, their own mortality, the nature of courage and honour. The long dark nights became a time for philosophy, for self-examination. Others focused on practical tasks. If your hands were busy, your mind had less time to wander into dark places. Women spun and wove endlessly. Men carved, whittled, repaired tools, made new ones. And some people simply endured. They survived one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, waiting for the light to return. Because eventually it would. The days would begin to lengthen, slowly at first, then more noticeably. By late January or early February you could feel it. The sun was climbing higher, staying longer. The worst was past. But until that turning point you lived in the darkness. And the darkness lived in you. Chapter 9. Violence, Law and Survival. Winter in Viking society wasn't just a battle against nature. It was also a time when human nature, with all its capacity for violence, revenge and conflict, became particularly dangerous. Let's be clear, Viking society was violent. This wasn't a flaw or an aberration, it was baked into the culture. Honour, reputation and strength were paramount. Insults demanded satisfaction. Wrongs required revenge, and the legal system, such as it was, acknowledged this reality. In the winter, tensions that might have been manageable in the summer became explosive. You're trapped in a small space with the same people for months. You're cold, hungry, tired and stressed. The darkness weighs on everyone's mood. And unlike the summer, when you could work out your frustrations through physical labour, or take a trip to blow off steam, there's nowhere to go. Arguments escalated quickly. Maybe someone accuses your brother of cheating at dice. Maybe your neighbour's fence breaks and his sheep eat your precious hay stores. Maybe someone makes a crude joke about your wife. Maybe old grievances from years ago resurface during a drunken evening. In any of these situations, violence is a possibility. The Norse had a concept called howling, a formal duel to settle disputes. If two men had a serious disagreement, they could agree to meet at a designated place and fight it out, usually until first blood or until one man yielded. This was legal, socially accepted, and witnessed by the community. But howling was a summer activity. In the winter, duels were impractical, the ground was frozen, the footing treacherous, and the cold made fighting even more dangerous. So disputes festered, men nursed grudges, feuds developed. A feud in Viking society was serious business. It wasn't just between two individuals, it involved entire families. If someone from family A killed someone from family B was honour-bound to seek revenge. This might mean killing the original killer, or it might mean killing one of his relatives. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. Feuds could last generations. They could tear communities apart. The Norse had legal mechanisms to prevent or resolve feuds. The Thing, a local assembly where disputes were heard and judgments made, was the cornerstone of Norse law. But the Thing typically met during the summer, not the winter. So if a killing happened in January, the perpetrator and the victim's family had to wait months before the case could be heard. In the meantime, the victim's family might decide to take matters into their own hands. Revenge killings were understood, if not always approved of. The law recognised the right of a family to seek compensation. Vergild, a payment in silver or goods that could settle a debt of blood. But negotiations over Vergild could break down. Pride, poverty, or simple hatred might prevent a settlement. And then you had an active feud on your hands right in the middle of winter when everyone was already on edge. One historical case illustrates this perfectly. The saga of Grettir the Strong tells of a man who became an outlaw during winter, forced to survive alone in the wilderness because he'd killed someone and couldn't pay compensation. Outlawry was one of the harshest punishments in Norse society. It meant you were outside the law's protection. Anyone could kill you without consequence. Your property was forfeit. Your family couldn't help you without becoming outlaws themselves. To be outlawed in summer was bad enough. To be outlawed in winter was almost certainly a death sentence. There were also structural violences built into the society. Thralls, slaves, were property. They had no legal rights. If you owned thralls, you could beat them, rape them, kill them, and face no legal consequences. This wasn't considered violence in the legal sense. It was property management. Thralls did the worst work, mucking out the animals, hauling water in the freezing cold, sleeping in the coldest parts of the longhouse. They ate last and least. In a bad winter, if food ran short, thralls starved first. Some thralls were war captives. Others were born into slavery, children of enslaved parents. Still others had been enslaved as punishment for crimes or debts. Regardless of how they'd become thralls, their lives were hard and their deaths often unremarked. Women, while not property in the same way thralls were, still lived in a deeply patriarchal society. A woman's legal status was tied to her male relatives, her father, her husband, her sons. She could own property and had some legal protections, but she was also expected to be obedient, productive, and sexually faithful. Domestic violence was not uncommon. A man was allowed to discipline his wife, and as long as he didn't permanently injure or kill her, the law turned a blind eye. In the close confines of winter, with no escape and no privacy, women suffered. But women weren't entirely powerless. Some were fierce, cunning, and willing to fight for their interests. The sagas are full of strong-willed women who manipulated situations, urged their male relatives to action, or even took up weapons themselves. One famous story tells of a woman named Freydis Eriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red. During a conflict in Vinland, North America, she reportedly grabbed a sword and, though heavily pregnant, charged at attacking natives, slapping the blade against her breast and screaming. The attackers fled. Whether the story is entirely true or embellished, it reflects the Norse ideal that courage wasn't exclusively male. Children, too, were vulnerable. They were expected to be tough, to endure hardship without complaint. Weak or sickly infants might be exposed, left outside to die. This sounds horrific to modern ears, but in a subsistent society where resources were limited, it was sometimes seen as necessary. A child who couldn't survive infancy wouldn't survive the harsh realities of Norse life. The winter was when these harsh realities became most apparent. When you're on the edge of starvation, when every mouth to feed is a burden, when the cold can kill anyone who isn't strong enough, societies make brutal calculations. And yet, alongside this violence, there was also law, structure, and a strong sense of community obligation. Your neighbours might be feuding with you, but if your longhouse burned down, they'd still help you rebuild. If you were injured and couldn't work, your family and community would support you. To a point. If you were an honourable person who'd contributed to the community, you'd be taken care of. If you were lazy, dishonourable, or a troublemaker, you might be left to fend for yourself. Reputation was everything. Your honour, your social standing, your trustworthiness, your courage, determined how you were treated. A person with a good reputation could borrow tools, negotiate favourable marriages for their children, and expect help in times of need. A person with a bad reputation was isolated, vulnerable, and likely to die young. So you worked hard to maintain your honour. You kept your word. You showed courage in the face of hardship. You contributed to the community. You avenged insults carefully, balancing the need to maintain respect with the danger of starting a feud that could destroy your family. Winter was a time when all of these social dynamics were intensified. The cold and darkness put everyone on edge. The close quarters made every interaction more charged, and the knowledge that you had months more of this ahead made people desperate. Desperation leads to violence. Violence leads to blood. Blood demands justice or revenge, and the cycle continues. To survive a Viking winter, you didn't just need to survive the cold, you needed to survive each other. Chapter 10. The Spring Thaw and What Remains. Slowly, painfully slowly, the days begin to lengthen. It's subtle at first. You notice the sun lingering a few minutes longer on the horizon. The darkness loosens its grip just a little. By late February, if you're still alive, you start to dare to hope. The worst is passing. You've made it through the darkest months. Now you just have to survive until the thaw. But the end of winter brings its own challenges. The snow begins to melt, but it doesn't disappear overnight. For weeks, everything is wet. The ground is muddy. The roof leaks more as snow slides off and exposes gaps in the thatch. The paths become treacherous rivers of slush. This is when disease often strikes hardest. All the filth that's been accumulating for months, the animal waste, the human waste, the rotting garbage, starts to thaw and mix with the meltwater. The smell is indescribable, and the risk of contamination skyrockets. Spring fevers sweep through communities. Weakened by months of poor nutrition and constant cold, people's immune systems are vulnerable. What might have been a minor illness in the autumn becomes deadly in the spring. Children and the elderly die in the final weeks of winter, so close to having made it through. But for those who survive, there's work to be done. As soon as the ground is soft enough, you need to start preparing for planting. Fields need to be ploughed. Seeds need to be ready. Every day of delay means a shorter growing season and less food next winter. You're exhausted. Your body's worn down, your hands are cracked and bleeding from months of hard work in the cold, but you push through because stopping isn't an option. The livestock too are in rough shape. They've lost weight over the winter, living on diminishing hay rations. Some didn't make it. You found them dead in the barn one morning, too weak to continue. You butchered them quickly before the meat spoiled and added them to the stew. The surviving animals need to be taken out to pasture as soon as there's enough grass. They're weak and wobbly on their legs, but they'll recover with fresh grazing. You assess your stores. How much grain is left? How much salted meat? How much cheese? With luck and careful rationing, you have just enough to make it until the first spring greens are ready to harvest, and the first lambs are big enough to slaughter. If you miscalculated, this is when starvation becomes real. This is when families are forced to eat seed grain, the grain that should be planted for next year's crop. It's a desperate choice, sacrificing the future to survive the present. But what else can you do? Some families don't make it. You hear that old Bjorn and his wife died in the night quietly in their sleep. Starvation and exhaustion finally claimed them. Their children will inherit what little they had. You hear that a baby was born 2 villages over but didn't survive the night. Winter claimed one more. The survivors are haunted, marked by the experience. Everyone has lost weight. Faces are gaunt. Eyes are hollow. Some people have frostbite scars, missing fingertips, blackened ears. Others have the lingering cough that never quite went away. But there's also relief, joy even. The sun is warm on your face. The birds are returning. The first green shoots are pushing through the thawed earth. People emerge from their longhouses like creatures coming out of hibernation. You see your neighbours for the first time in weeks. You share stories of survival, of who made it and who didn't. There's a sense of collective triumph. You did it. You survived another winter. The thing convenes, and the legal matters that have been suspended all winter are finally addressed. Feuds are settled or formalised. Debts are paid. Marriages are arranged. Justice, delayed by the snow, finally moves forward. Trade resumes. If you live near the coast, you watch for the first ships to appear. Merchants who've been waiting out the winter in warmer lands now return with goods. Iron, salt, honey, fabric, luxuries you haven't seen in months. You trade furs, walrus ivory, and whatever surplus you have for things you need. Or you simply marvel at the wares, knowing you can't afford them but enjoying the reminder that there's a wider world beyond your frozen village. Raiding parties begin to form. Young men, restless after months of confinement, eager to prove themselves and win wealth and glory, sign on to join expeditions. Some will sail west to Ireland or Britain. Others will head east along the rivers of Russia. They'll be gone for months and not all of them will return. But that's a problem for future you. Right now you're just grateful to feel warmth again. You take stock of yourself. You're thinner, weaker, older. The winter has aged you. You see it in the mirror of the well water, new lines on your face, grey in your hair that wasn't there before, but you're alive. And in a Viking winter, that's no small achievement. You think about next winter. You need to gather more firewood, cure more meat, repair the roof properly this time. You need to be better prepared, because winter will come again. It always does. But for now, you stand in the pale spring sunlight, close your eyes, and breathe. You survived. Chapter 11. What they didn't tell you. History has a way of smoothing over the rough edges. When we think of the Vikings, we think of dragon ships, epic sagas, warriors with braided beards exploring distant lands. We don't think about the cold, the hunger, the darkness, the endless grinding monotony of survival. But that was the reality for most people in the Viking Age. Not glory, survival. Let's be honest about what life was like. The average Viking wasn't a warrior. They were a farmer, a fisherman, a craftsperson, someone who worked every day just to have enough food, fuel and shelter to make it through another winter. Life expectancy was short, around 40-50 years if you made it past childhood, which was a big if. Nearly half of all children died before age 5 from disease, malnutrition, accidents, or exposure. If you were female, your most dangerous years were your childbearing years. Maternal mortality was high. Many women didn't survive their third or fourth pregnancy. If you were male, your most dangerous years were your late teens and 20s, prime raiding age. Violence, shipwrecks, and battles killed many young men. If you were elderly, you became increasingly vulnerable. Once you could no longer work effectively, you were dependent on your family's goodwill. In good times, you'd be cared for with respect. In hard times, you might be seen as a burden. The Norse practiced what's sometimes called senecide, the killing of the elderly during times of extreme hardship. Whether this actually happened or was just a later myth is debated by historians, but the fact that the stories exist tells you something about the calculations people were willing to make when survival was at stake. Disability was similarly difficult. If you lost a limb, if you were blinded, if you became unable to work, your value to the community decreased. You might be cared for out of loyalty or affection, but you were aware that you were now dependent, potentially a burden. Mental illness was poorly understood and feared. Someone who became erratic, violent, or catatonic might be seen as cursed, touched by spirits, or simply broken. There was little support and no treatment. And yet, despite all of this, people found joy. They laughed. They told jokes. They fell in love. They sang songs and played games and found pleasure in small things. A warm fire, a full belly, a clear starry night. The human spirit is remarkably resilient. Even in the harshest conditions, people create meaning, form bonds, and find reasons to continue. The Vikings weren't superhuman. They were just people who adapted to an incredibly harsh environment and developed a culture that prioritized strength, resilience, and community because those were the traits that kept you alive. Their religion reflected this. The Norse gods weren't all powerful, all good beings who promised eternal paradise. They were powerful but flawed, capable of trickery, violence, and mistakes. They fought constantly against forces of chaos, giants, monsters, entropy itself, and they were fated to lose. Ragnarok, the end of the world, was inevitable. The gods would fight bravely, but they would fall. The world would be destroyed, and then, maybe, it would be reborn. This worldview makes sense when you live in a place where winter tries to kill you every year. You fight not because you're guaranteed to win, but because fighting is what you do. You endure not because it's easy, but because endurance is the only option. Courage, in the Norse conception, wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting despite fear. It was facing death, in battle, in childbirth, in the frozen darkness, with dignity. The sagas celebrate heroes not because they were invincible, but because they kept going even when the outcome was hopeless. This is the truth of the Viking winter. It wasn't heroic, it was hard, it was brutal. It was a test that many failed, but those who passed it, who survived the cold, the hunger, the darkness, and each other, earned something. Not glory, not fame, just another year of life. And in a world where life was fragile and uncertain, that was enough. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Endurance. So why does any of this matter? Why should we, living in heated homes with full refrigerators and electric lights, care about how people survived winters 1,000 years ago? Because their struggles shaped the world we live in today. The Vikings weren't just survivors, they were innovators. They developed shipbuilding techniques that allowed them to cross oceans. They created navigational methods that worked without compasses or maps. They established trade networks that spanned from Baghdad to North America. All of this came from people who spent half their lives just trying not to freeze to death. The necessity of surviving winter made them resourceful. They learned to preserve food in ways that are still used today: smoking, salting, pickling, fermenting. Modern Scandinavian cuisine, with its emphasis on preserved fish, pickled vegetables, and fermented dairy, is a direct descendant of Viking survival techniques. They built homes designed to trap and conserve heat, using turf insulation and efficient hearth designs. Modern Scandinavian architecture, with its focus on warmth, coziness, the concept of hygge, and connection to nature, echoes these ancient priorities. They developed social structures that emphasized community support and collective responsibility. The Norse thing, a democratic assembly where free men could voice opinions and vote on matters, was a precursor to modern parliamentary systems. They created a legal framework that, while harsh by modern standards provided structure and predictability. The concept of vergild, compensation for wrongs, is an early form of restorative justice. Their mythology and storytelling tradition preserved knowledge, values, and cultural identity across generations. The sagas, written down centuries later, give us a window into their mindset, pragmatic, stoic, focused on honour and endurance. But perhaps the most important legacy is psychological. The Vikings understood something that we're in danger of forgetting. That comfort is not the natural state of humanity. That survival requires effort, planning, and sacrifice. That community bonds are forged in shared hardship, not in isolation and abundance. They knew that winter would come, and they prepared for it. They gathered resources when times were good, so they could endure when times were bad. They didn't expect life to be easy or fair. They expected it to be hard, and they built their culture around that expectation. This mindset, this clear-eyed acceptance of reality combined with fierce determination to survive, is worth remembering. In our modern world, we've insulated ourselves from the direct experience of nature's harshness. We've created systems that keep us warm, fed, and safe with minimal daily effort. This is wonderful. This is progress. I'm not suggesting we should return to living in smoky longhouses and eating porridge for 4 months straight, but we've also lost something in the process. We've lost the daily reminder of our own fragility. We've lost the visceral understanding that survival is not guaranteed, that it must be worked for, that it requires foresight and cooperation and resilience. When our heating systems fail, when supply chains are disrupted, when natural disasters strike, we're often unprepared, not just practically but psychologically. We're shocked that our comfort could be so easily disrupted. We panic because we've forgotten how to endure. The Vikings would look at us with confusion. They'd see people with miraculous technology, machines that create warmth without fire, lights that burn without fuel, food that appears without farming, but also people who fall apart when the machines stop working. They'd probably wonder why we don't store more food, why we don't know how to start a fire without matches, why we don't maintain strong bonds with our neighbours, why we live alone in houses designed for privacy rather than survival. And they'd probably be right to wonder. This isn't about romanticising the past. Viking winters were brutal, and I wouldn't wish that life on anyone. People died, children starved, disease was rampant, the cold was merciless. But those people developed something we've partially lost, the ability to endure, the knowledge that hard times will come and must be prepared for, the understanding that we need each other to survive. Chapter 13. Lessons from the Frozen North. Let's extract some practical wisdom from all this suffering and survival. What can we learn from people who endured months of darkness, cold, and deprivation? Lesson 1. Preparation is everything. The Vikings didn't wait for winter to start gathering firewood. They spent the summer and autumn preparing. They harvested every crop, preserved every scrap of food, repaired every tool, and reinforced every structure. They understood that when the crisis hits, it's too late to prepare. You survive on what you've already done. This applies to more than just winter. Financial crashes, pandemics, natural disasters. These things come without much warning. The people who survive them best are the ones who prepared before they were necessary. Do you have emergency supplies? Do you know your neighbours? Do you have skills that don't depend on electricity or supply chains? These aren't paranoid questions. They're practical ones. Lesson 2. Community as survival. No Viking survived winter alone. Even the wealthiest Jarl needed farmers to grow food, craftspeople to make tools, neighbours to help rebuild after disasters. The Norse understood that individualism is a luxury of good times. In hard times, you need people. You need cooperation, shared resources, mutual obligation. Modern society prizes independence, but there's a difference between independence and isolation. True resilience comes from being part of a community where people support each other, not out of forced obligation, but out of mutual recognition that we're all vulnerable and we all need help sometimes. Lesson 3. Boredom is not an emergency. The Vikings spent months doing repetitive, tedious work, spinning, weaving, carving, sitting by the fire. No screens, no constant stimulation, no infinite scroll. They learned to find contentment in monotony. They developed rich inner lives. They told stories, contemplated their beliefs, strengthened relationships. We've become addicted to novelty and stimulation. We treat boredom as an emergency that must be immediately solved. But boredom is not dangerous. Discomfort is not harm. Learning to sit with boredom, to find meaning in repetitive work, to be content with simple pleasures. These are skills worth cultivating. Lesson 4. Darkness and difficulty are temporary. No matter how brutal the winter, spring always came. The Norse trusted this. They endured because they knew the suffering was temporary. This is true for most hardships. The darkest hour really is before the dawn. Most crises, while terrible in the moment, eventually pass. The key is maintaining hope without denying reality. The Vikings didn't pretend winter wasn't hard. They acknowledged it fully, but they also maintained faith that it would end. Lesson 5. Comfort is contingent. The Vikings never took warmth, food, or safety for granted. They knew these things had to be constantly worked for, that they could be lost, that they were precious. We've become so accustomed to comfort that we treat it as a right rather than a privilege. When it's taken away, even briefly, we react with outrage rather than adaptation. Understanding that comfort is contingent, that it must be earned and maintained, makes us both more grateful for what we have and more capable of enduring when we don't have it. Lesson 6. Suffering does not require meaning. The Norse didn't try to find cosmic meaning in their suffering. Winter was hard because winter was hard. People died because nature was cruel. Accidents happened because accidents happen. They didn't need suffering to teach them lessons or make them better people. They simply endured it because that's what survival required. Modern culture often tries to assign meaning to every hardship. Everything happens for a reason. This is a learning opportunity. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes suffering is just suffering. Sometimes bad things happen for no reason, and that's okay. You don't need to extract a lesson from every hardship, you just need to survive it. Lesson 7. Death is the only certainty. The Norse lived intimately with death. It was always close, in childbirth, in accidents, in illness, in violence, in the cold. They didn't fear it as much as we do, not because they were braver, but because they couldn't afford to. They believed in facing death with dignity, in dying well, in being remembered for how they lived, not how long they lived. We've sanitized death, hidden it away in hospitals and funeral homes, and in doing so we've made it more frightening. We forget that death is the only guaranteed outcome of life. Everything else is uncertain. The Norse understanding of mortality was healthier in some ways. They didn't obsess over longevity. They focused on living well, acting honourably, contributing to their community. When death came, they met it. Lesson 8. You're tougher than you think. The Vikings weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people, farmers, fishers, weavers, who endured extraordinary conditions. They were cold, hungry, scared, and exhausted. But they kept going anyway. You have that same capacity. Most of us have never been truly tested. We don't know what we're capable of enduring until we're forced to. The Vikings would tell you, when hardship comes, you'll surprise yourself. You'll find reserves of strength you didn't know you had. You'll endure things you thought would break you, not because you're special, but because humans are remarkably resilient when we have to be. Chapter 14. The Modern Winter. Let me bring this back to the present. Why am I talking about Viking winters in 2024? Because I think we're facing our own kind of winter. Not literal cold, though climate change is making weather increasingly extreme. But metaphorical winters, economic uncertainty, political instability, social fragmentation, pandemics, rising costs of living, increasing isolation despite constant connectivity. These aren't the same as a Viking winter, obviously, but they share some characteristics. They're difficult, they're somewhat unpredictable, they require endurance, and they're easier to survive if you're prepared and connected to others. The Vikings survived because they were realistic about their situation. They didn't pretend winter wasn't coming. They didn't expect it to be easy. They prepared as best they could, supported each other, and endured. We could learn from that approach. Instead of being shocked when things go wrong, we could prepare for inevitable difficulties. Instead of trying to face challenges alone, we could build stronger communities. Instead of expecting constant comfort and ease, we could develop our capacity to endure discomfort. This doesn't mean being pessimistic or paranoid. The Vikings weren't depressed nihilists. They celebrated when there was reason to celebrate. They enjoyed the good seasons. They found joy in small things. But they were prepared for hardship. They knew it was coming, and when it arrived, they were ready. Chapter 15. The fire still burns. Here's what I want you to take away from this journey into the frozen past. Those people, cold, hungry, scared, exhausted, kept the fire burning. They tended it carefully, fed it constantly, protected it from wind and snow and the endless dark. That fire was more than warmth. It was hope. It was life. It was the promise that spring would come again. And it always did. Every spring the survivors emerged from their longhouses, blinking in the sunlight, grateful to be alive. They planted their fields. They repaired their boats. They told stories about the winter that had passed, stories that would be retold for generations. They understood something profound, that survival itself is victory, that endurance is heroic, even when it's not dramatic, that the simple act of continuing, of keeping the fire lit through the darkest nights is worthy of honour. You carry their legacy in your genes. If you have any Scandinavian ancestry, you're descended from people who survived countless winters. If you don't, you're descended from people who survived countless other hardships. Different climates, different challenges, but all requiring the same fundamental resilience. Every single one of your ancestors made it to reproductive age. Every single one survived long enough to create the next generation. You exist because of an unbroken chain of survivors stretching back thousands of years. You have that strength in you. You just might not have needed it yet. But when your winter comes, and it will come, in one form or another, you'll find it. You'll discover that you can endure more than you thought, that you can survive things that seemed impossible, that you can keep going when every instinct says to stop, not because you're special, but because you're human. And humans, for all our flaws and weaknesses, are remarkably good at survival. The Vikings proved that. They lived in one of the harshest environments imaginable, in an age without modern technology or medical knowledge, and they not only survived, they thrived. They explored, traded, created art, told stories, built communities, and left a legacy that still resonates today. If they could survive those winters, you can survive whatever challenges you're facing. Chapter 16. Final thoughts from the dark. It's late now. The fire has burned low. Outside the wind howls, though in your case it's probably just traffic or the hum of your heating system rather than a literal blizzard. You're warm, you're fed, you're safe. You have light at the touch of a switch and heat without the need to chop wood. You have access to food from around the world, medicine that can cure diseases that once killed millions, and communication technology that lets you connect with anyone, anywhere. You are, by any objective measure, living in unprecedented comfort and security. But you're also human, which means you're still subject to fear, loss, hardship, and suffering. The forms are different, but the experience is the same. You might lose a job. A relationship might end, a loved one might get sick, financial disaster might strike, depression might drag you into darkness, anxiety might make every day feel like a battle. These aren't Viking winters, but they're your winters, and they're real. When those times come, remember the people we've talked about tonight. Remember that humans have always faced hardship, that we've always found ways to endure, that we've always kept the fire burning even in the darkest nights. You don't need to be a warrior. You don't need to be extraordinary. You just need to be stubborn enough to keep going, wise enough to accept help, and patient enough to wait for spring. Because spring always comes. Always. The ice melts, the sun returns, the darkness lifts, life continues. That's the promise. That's the hope that kept the Vikings alive through months of cold and hunger and fear, and it's the hope that can keep you alive through whatever winter you're facing. Closing. So, here we are, at the end of our journey into the frozen past. We've walked through the cold, felt the hunger, sat in the darkness, and emerged, like the Vikings before us, still alive. I hope this gave you a new perspective on both history and your own life. I hope it made you grateful for your heating system and your refrigerator and your electric lights. I hope it made you think about preparation, community, and resilience. But most of all, I hope it reminded you that you're capable of more than you think. That hardship, while terrible, is survivable, that humans have endured worse and still found reasons to celebrate, to love, to hope. The fire still burns. It's burned for thousands of years, tended by countless hands, kept alive through ice ages and dark ages and every kind of catastrophe. Your job, all of our jobs, is to keep it burning, to add our fuel to the flame, to pass it on to the next generation so they can face their own winters. That's the legacy of the Vikings. Not conquest or violence or adventure, but endurance. The simple, stubborn refusal to let the fire go out. So tend your fire, prepare for winter, support your community, endure the darkness, wait for spring, and remember, you're tougher than you think. Thanks for joining me on this cold, dark journey. If you enjoyed this exploration of Viking winters, leave a like, subscribe for more deep dives into history's harsh realities, and drop a comment telling me what aspect of Viking life you'd like me to explore next. Stay warm out there, and remember, winter is coming, but you'll survive it. You always have. The fire crackles, the wind howls, but inside where you sit you're warm and alive, and that's enough. Historical note: the experiences described in this video are based on archaeological evidence, historical texts including the Icelandic sagas, and scholarly research into Viking Age Scandinavia. While we've dramatised the personal experience for narrative purposes, the conditions, the cold, the darkness, the food preservation methods, the medical practices, the social structures are all grounded in historical fact. The Viking Age lasted roughly from 793 CE to 1066 CE, and conditions varied widely depending on location, social status, and specific time period. A wealthy jarl in Denmark had a very different winter experience than a poor farmer in northern Norway, but the fundamental challenges — cold, darkness, limited resources, and the need for community — were universal. For those interested in learning more, I recommend the following sources: The Viking World, edited by Stefan Brink and Neil Price; Daily Life of the Vikings by Kirsten Wolfe; The Penguin Historical Atlas of the Vikings by John Haywood; archaeological findings from sites like Lonso Meadows, Hedeby, and Rub the Icelandic sagas, particularly Egil's saga, Njal's saga, and Grettir's saga. History is about more than dates and battles. It's about how people lived, suffered, endured, and found meaning in the midst of circumstances we can barely imagine. The Vikings were real people, flawed, frightened, struggling, who happened to live in one of the most challenging environments imaginable. They deserve to be remembered not just as warriors and explorers, but as survivors, because survival in the end is the greatest adventure of all. This has been Sleepless Survivors. Until next time, keep the fire burning.